From a modern English perspective, at least from the perspective of monolingual English speakers, Old English can sometimes seem extremely foreign and surprisingly bizarre sounding. For example, if I went up to someone and just started reciting Beowulf to them, saying like "Tham averawas after kenned jongen jardum," they would be like, "It doesn't sound like English at all." People will often say like, "Oh, that kind of sounds like Dutch," or "That kind of sounds like German," or something like that. To a Dutch speaker, what does it sound like?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's difficult for me to say at this point because I think I've been studying Old English for about 15 years, I think, by this
Mm,
point. And also, I was raised bilingually, so I have an Australian mother, a Dutch father. So Old English was. I've never approached Old English a monolingual Dutch point of view, but the reason why I got into Old English is really because it reminded me of both of the languages that I grew up with. So I think for a Dutch speaker, it certainly sounds foreign as well. I mean, it's a Germanic language with a lot of, full vowels and unstressed syllables, which for most Dutch people, I think I did ask some people, what does Old English sound to you? And I did get the answer, vaguely, it sounds vaguely Scandinavian, a couple of times. So I think that is one aspect. I think Old English can look quite recognizable in some cases to Dutch speakers. If you take the Old English word way, for example, which means way, and the Dutch word weg, they're spelt identically. They're pronounced completely differently because Dutch has the vela fricative at the end, but it's WEG or wooden EG if you want. So I think that helps for recognition. I think also what helps for Dutch people, once you give them a brief introduction to what the language looks like, they start recognizing words. So words like worden and lucht are very close to Dutch worden and lucht, much closer than their modern English, well, not descendants, but equivalents, become and sky or air. So I think that helps as well. So returning to your question and summarizing more briefly, I think Old English can seem just as foreign to a modern Dutch speaker as it does to a modern English speaker. But once you sort of introduce students, to the language briefly, they'll start to recognize a lot of words and a lot of constructions as well. I mean, if we stick with Weldon, I think there are some Bible translations in which you see a very literal kind of "tha was geworden," and the past participle of worden in Dutch is also geworden. And if you see a word that's spelled exactly the same, I think that yeah, that really helps in terms of recognition as well.
yeah, I think that's something that definitely helps bridge these gaps. I remember once I was on a flight and I was sitting next to an Icelandic, I think it was like the Icelandic Minister of like Environmental Concerns or something like that, which was pretty sick that he was flying economy.
Yeah.
But he was very interested in, I was reading Beowulf and he was very interested that I was reading it, and he had never read any Old English before. And he's, of course, bilingual, English, Icelandic, and of course spoke a little Danish and a little German as well,
Yeah.
as is the tricks of the trade with these people. And he couldn't understand it at all when I was speaking it to him. I would like recite passages to him and be like, "Does that make any sense to you?" And he would be like, "No." But when he saw it written down, he immediately began to draw connections. And even there were a few words I can't remember off the top of my head that are present in Icelandic and present in Old English that we have lost in
Yeah.
modern English that he immediately recognized. There are also a lot of times where when you say it aloud, it's much more understandable than when you can see it written down. So I remember once when I was actually bartending to pay for college, I had a table of Dutch speakers. And I was like, hey, people have often said that Dutch and Old English are pretty similar. I wonder if you guys could understand parts of this. And I just read a couple lines of Beowulf to them, and I was just beginning. So the one that was at the top of my mind was that was gold Koning. And to a modern English speaker, Koning, it's like, okay, I guess that's king, but it sounds a little weird. But to Dutch and German speakers, Koning is that's very obvious what that is, you know?
Yeah. It helps that it's disyllabic. That's absolutely true. Yeah.
Hmm.
Koning, koning. Yeah. Dat was een
Yeah.
goede koning. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
If you give Beowulf as an example, you're also dealing with the constraints of poetry, right? You're dealing
Hmm.
with word order that's not entirely common in prose, different vocabulary, which may help sometimes. I mean, you have Old English poetic scene for like the possessive scene, whereas the prose normally has his. things like that. That's closer to Dutch, zijn. So sometimes poetry may help. But I wonder what would happen if you, maybe I should try this, give a group of Dutch speakers a sample of Ælfric and some really kind of basic prose to see whether that might aid comprehension. It would be an
Oh,
interesting
for
experiment,
sure.
I think.
For sure. Yeah, Simon Roper actually has a video that he published recently where he is giving a single monologue, and every sentence he moves forward by about 50 years.
Oh yeah, great
So
video. Yeah,
he begins in like the 5th century, if I'm not mistaken, and then
yeah,
makes it all the way to like a New York American modern accent. And there are a lot of comments that as soon as he got to like 950, it was suddenly understandable. I
yeah.
think he was probably speaking Mercian because he wants to have that like single line all the way
Makes
back.
sense. Yeah,
But so not quite as similar as Ælfric, but still, I mean, it suddenly there were people that had commented things like, "I can't believe how it sounded like utter gibberish until suddenly it started making complete sense." Something like, "Se winter is long and cold," that kind of
yeah,
thing. Like, okay, that makes total sense. But
yeah,
in Beowulf,
yeah. I think
and Beowulf it was, we know that it was archaic even at the time of composition, which is probably the early 8th century. And we know that the poet was using not only a series of archaic vocabulary, but also archaic word order. He was essentially using Proto-Germanic word order. He breaches from it occasionally, which betrays the fact that he's not actually living in the 5th century. But
yeah,
but every once in a while he'll most of the time he's using a very, very archaic word order. So it's going to be really difficult for anyone in the Germanic families to understand it because it's so old.
yeah. True. Absolutely.
So these West Germanic languages then, English, Dutch, German, I think are the biggest high profile ones. Not a lot of people talk about Frisian. Could you first, maybe to anyone who doesn't, you know, let it not be so, but if anyone doesn't know what Frisian is, could you maybe explain to them what that is?
Yeah, sure. Frisian is technically classified as a language family nowadays. We have West
Mm.
Frisian in the Netherlands, and then we also have the East Frisian and the North Frisian language families. I'm not a Frisian expert, so if there are any Frisians in the comments who want to correct me on stuff, please do. I'm not a native Frisian speaker either, although we do have a lot of them in the Netherlands, in the province
Mhm.
of, well, surprise, surprise, Friesland, or Friesland, as they call it in Frisian. Um, but it's the closest language. Well, that's debatable. It's one of the closest languages to English. It depends on how you would classify
Mhm.
Scots. If you classify that as a separate language, then that would be the closest language. But if you do not, then Frisian would be the closest language. Um, and well, if you go back to Old English and Old Frisian, you'll see that there are a lot of similarities in terms of grammar. Even nowadays, if I say a sentence like boter, breë en groene cheese is goed Engels and goed Fries, that's of course the famous sentence that everyone says. And apologies to the Frisians for butchering the pronunciation, but you can hear that things like green is green. That sounds the same. Sounds nothing like Dutch groen.
Mhm.
Skiep is a sheep. Sounds nothing like Dutch schaap. So the sounds are closer together, and I think it might be easier for an English speaker to guess the meaning of a number of Frisian words due to shared history. One of the things that I like about modern Frisian is that it actually preserves some archaic features of the West Germanic languages. For instance, Frisian, modern Frisian, I'm limiting myself to West Frisian because I don't know anything about the other varieties, but the variety spoken in the Netherlands um, still has a second class of weak verbs, which I think is very cool, and it's also the most productive class.
Mm.
So, and it ends in y, which is very similar to Old Frisian ia and Old Frisian ia and Old English ian, so luvian.
Mhm.
Woonian, for instance, is wijnje. So it has a completely different conjugation when compared to the first class of weak verbs, which I think is a very cool archaic feature, even in modern
Mhm.
Frisian today. Um, and yeah,
So
what
just to
else is there to
clarify
say?
that real quick, Old English has a set of verbs known as weak class two, and the two examples that Amos has just used, Luvian and Wunian, Luvian being to love, Wunian being to like live or to stay somewhere. And then this obviously is not a feature of modern English. We don't say things like ich luvie the, we say I love you. And what he's saying essentially is, correct me if I'm wrong, that Frisian also has this feature that was in Old English, no longer in modern English, still in Frisian.
Yeah.
That's pretty sick.
Yeah, it's very cool. I think it's only the North Germanic languages that actually preserve different classes of weak verbs, mainly. So the fact that a West Germanic language, Frisian, still does this is, I think, pretty cool.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
One question that I wanted to ask, it might be difficult, is if you were talking to a linguist who didn't really have any familiarity at all with the West Germanic languages, it would be difficult because how would you be speaking to them in the first place if they didn't know English? But how would you describe them? Like, how would you characterize the West Germanic languages in a sort of linguistic way?
I think it also depends on what time period you're talking about. So if we're talking
Hmm.
about the old variety of most West Germanic languages, I would say that they are languages which in general have four cases, maybe also a fifth one. So nominative, accusative, genitive, dative, and maybe sometimes an instrumental. In the case of Old High German, Old Saxon, definitely. In the case of Old English, not by the end of the period. Old Dutch, there's too little to go on, so I'm not sure about that. And Old Frisian, definitely not. But it should also be said that Old Frisian, the first attestations of Old Frisian are actually during the middle period of most of the other West Germanic languages, so about from 1200 onwards. So that skews things a little bit as well. I would say that the verb system is quite simple. What is simple? I mean, that's a subjective thing to say, but generally, as for most Germanic languages, we have a present and a past. And people may say, well, in English, I can say I will go, and that's true. That's a future, but it's a periphrastic. We would call this a periphrastic future because you need an extra word to make it a future. It's not like some like in Latin, where you would say something like videbo, I will see.
Yeah.
You add something. Apologies for using ecclesiastical, but hey,
Yeah, I was about to say
I'm a medieval,
it.
I'm a medievalist. You add an ending to a word or change it in some morphological way to show that you are changing tenses. But English and no West Germanic language has this. We have present, I go, and then past, I went. That's a bad example to use, I realize now. Um, we have verbs that change their vowel, for instance. I write, I wrote, and
Yeah.
verbs that simply add a suffix. So I love, I loved.
Hmm.
Um, so in terms of verbs, pretty simple, I guess. Um, I think it's also important to realize that within West Germanic there are various subgroupings which also show different characteristics when you compare the languages to each other. So, for instance, Old English and Old Frisian are a subgrouping, but if we take that a little wider, then in general, North Sea Germanic, which is also called Ingvaeonic, is also a subgrouping, and that includes Old English, Old Frisian, but also Old Saxon. And what these languages have in common, for instance, is something that we call the Ingvaeonic nasal spirant law, which sounds very complex, but I'll explain it very simply. If we have an N or an M, if we have a nasal sound, so N or before a fricative, which is a sound that produces friction, so f or s, that N drops out in the Old period, and so Old English, Old Frisian period, um, and the vowel that precedes that sound is lengthened. So this is why Germans, for instance, say uns, and Dutch people say ons, but in Old English we say oos. Now it's a short vowel, of course, we say us, but in Old English oos. Also Old Frisian oos. Long vowel, no n, and then still the fricative s. And this is also why Dutch mond and German mund is English mouth. So that's one subgrouping that you can make within West Germanic of like the North Sea Germanic languages.
Yeah.
One other thing that they have in common, which is interesting, is that they have a single ending in the plural of verbs. So in Old English, I would say we helpeth, ye helpeth, he helpeth. So we help, you, plural help, they help. Whereas in Old Dutch, I would say we help on, so on, he helpet, et, and
Mm.
sia helpunt, unt. Also, Old High German does this, helfem, helfet, and helfant. So Ingvionic has only a single ending in the plural. This also applies to the past, by the way, when the ending is usually something like on or un. Um, the other Germanic languages have an N and then a T for the second person plural, and then an N again in the third person plural in the past. So I think that's another way in which you can recognize the Ingvionic Germanic languages. One other way, which may sound sort of basic, but it's still valid, I think, of dividing the West Germanic languages is between the languages that underwent the High German consonant shift and those languages which did not. So, what I mean when I talk about the High German consonant shift is, for instance, in German we say machen, or not we, I'm not German, sorry, but in German you say machen, whereas in English you say make, and in Dutch maken. German has Wasser, but in English it's water with a T, in Dutch water, T. And what was the other example? In German, we have auf, which is cognate to English up, and Dutch op with a P.
Mm.
Familiar, I think, to anyone who has ever seen German and think, wow, Wasser looks pretty close to water, but there's something different about it. Also, Zeit and tide, things like that. Um, it's not just German that has this, it's also the languages that descend from Old High German, so Luxembourgish and Yiddish. Um, but there are some dialects in the Netherlands as well, languages and dialects of those languages, for instance, Limburgish, which also have undergone that shift partially. The interesting thing is that I don't think there's not a single, so even standard modern High German has not completely undergone this shift. So I think one of the examples of like very southern dialects, but any Swiss people in the comments can correct me if I'm wrong. I think for like ancient Swiss, there was also a shift from k to k, so that kind, child, became kind. Standard High German has not undergone this shift, but I think some Swiss dialects have pronunciations like kind and komme for kind and kommen. So that's like an example of a variety that has completely undergone this shift, but Standard German has not had this. And so you can also make these distinctions in other dialects spoken in Germany. Also, I think Luxembourgish, for instance, has most of this shift, but then they say op instead of auf, and they say dat instead of das, which I also think so they preserve the older non-shifted varieties of those words. So, what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that it's probably more complex than just looking at German and saying, okay, this was one shift and it only happened in this
Right,
variety. It's a gradation kind of thing.
right. Do you consider, I mean, as a bilingual speaker, it would be tough to say, in your experience in the Netherlands and in, the UK and Australia and other English speaking spaces, do you consider Dutch and English to be relatively mutually intelligible at all?
That's that's very difficult for me to say because in my head they're normally the same language. Sometimes when I
Mm.
hear a Dutch song on the radio, I think it was in English, but it's not, and vice versa. So I don't know. Can I bounce the question back to you and ask you,
Sure,
do you
yeah.
think Dutch? I don't know how much Dutch you know, but if you see
Very
Dutch
little. Could you
on
give me
the
an
internet,
example?
if I say something like, ik zit hier nu achter mijn computer, what am I saying?
I'm sitting now after my computer.
Well, literally, that's perfect. Yeah. So we use achter as in behind. I'm behind my computer screen. I'm in front of my computer
Fascinating.
screen. But
Okay.
that's perfect. You use the cognate. That's fine. So you understood me.
That's awesome because I know that there's at least a relationship between after and aft,
Yeah.
from Old English aft, which now in modern English just means like the back,
Yeah.
instead of the old meaning of like back at you. Like you could say, I won't, could you say that eft? Could you say that
Yeah.
back? But
Yeah. Yeah.
now it
Yeah.
just means like the back of like a plane or like the boat or something like that. So you are essentially saying you're sitting sort of with regards to your computer in like the back, maybe? Is that like a decent
Yeah, it's
semantic?
a silly Dutch thing, I think, because why wouldn't you be in front of your computer screen? But it's probably said from from the point of view of the person who is looking at you, and you are sitting behind your screen, in the sense of
Hmm.
the viewpoint is from the person who is looking at you, sitting behind your monitor, sort of hidden away, I guess.
Yeah.
It
Could you give us
doesn't,
another one?
yeah,
That was
it's
fun.
idiomatic. Yeah. Okay, slightly more difficult. Ik hou heel erg van Oud-Engels.
Could you say the first like couple words again?
Ik hou heel erg.
Ich hal
Hou.
hou.
Hou. Yeah.
Ich hau. Ooh, I've got no idea what that might be.
Yeah, this was sneaky on my part. I'm sorry about that. But we have not uh we no longer have a descendant of a verb that means to love, of like the etymological. We don't say something like liefern or something like
Okay.
loeven or anything like that. Our verb to love is houden van, which means to hold of,
Hmm.
which is completely idiomatic, obviously. So what I said is ik hou heel erg van Oud-Engels means I really love Old English.
Ah, okay. The yeah,
I gave
the
this, I used this example on purpose because Dutch can be very recognizable, but we've also got a lot of idiomatic stuff that from like a German, even like a German perspective,
mhm,
Germans wouldn't know what this means. I don't think they would say use a form of Lieben, I guess,
right.
which we don't have. So this is something that you can't guess, probably.
Yeah. That was going to be my next question then. I know that you speak some German at least. How
High school
intelligible then
German.
Dutch and German then I assume are much more mutually intelligible. Is that true?
Um, I think if I see a, well, yeah. Dutch people normally take German in high school. I mean, it's an elective course at some point. You do have like 2 years of mandatory German, and then you can choose whether you want to do French or German. At least that's what it was like in my case. I did both because I love languages. You know, I still do.
Hmm.
Um, but that sort of skews my view of German a little bit because I was exposed to it
Right.
from starting from a young age, and I that doesn't go the other way. So most German people aren't exposed to Dutch. So normally when Dutch people hear German, either when Germans come to the Netherlands as tourists or simply because we read German news or something like that, I think we're a little bit more exposed to it. Um, and I think a lot of German is is guessable for Dutch people. Haben,
Yeah.
gehen, gaan, uh, mauer, muur. I mean, they're not pronounced the same. I think the main problem, but I don't want to speak for Germans, so Germans in the comments, give me your perspective. I think the main problem for Germans when they come to the Netherlands and they hear Dutch is that they don't understand it because a lot of the words are pronounced completely differently.
Hmm.
Maybe that I did speak to an elderly German couple once when I was on holiday. They asked me to explain talk about the history of a certain castle that I had just gone into, and they were, debating whether they wanted to go in or not. So I started explaining in German, and they asked me in German, "Are you Dutch?" And I said, "Yeah." Is my accent that bad? And they said, just say it in Dutch. So I very reluctantly, because I thought, how am I asked, do you speak Dutch? And they said, no, we don't speak Dutch, but we can understand it. So I just explained everything in Dutch and they said, oh, thanks. That's great. Yeah, we'll go in. So obviously there must be Germans that can understand Dutch. That they were older though, so I wonder if it's a
Hmm.
generational thing because most younger Germans that I've talked to cannot piece fast-spoken Dutch together. Um, yeah, but from my perspective, I think German is pretty much understandable. Yeah, especially when you read it. I think
Hmm.
I have more trouble with it when it's spoken quickly. But
Hmm.
yeah, who doesn't when it comes to a language that you don't really speak that well?
Yeah. What do you have to say about the sort of ongoing joke that a lot of monolingual English speakers will see Dutch written and kind of like giggle at it. The famous meme example, it looked like it says we have a serious problem
Yeah. We hebben een serieus
in Dutch.
probleem.
Okay,
Yeah.
yes, that's what it was.
Yeah.
And that one made the rounds on monolingual English Twitter of people just like, this cannot be a real language. Yeah, what's your defense of Dutch to these people?
Yeah, I don't want to sound like a party pooper, but I don't get the joke. I don't get it because it's very hard if it's your native language or at least one of your native languages. I it just looks like Dutch. And if I try and imagine that I only spoke English and no Dutch at all, and I saw Dutch for the first time, then I can see that it just looks that in some cases it does look like a goofy version of English. If that's the perspective, that you're coming from. Um, Obviously, as I hope to have demonstrated with the How de Von example, a lot more is going on. So yes, I mean, we have obvious cognates like water and water, slapen and sleep, no, schaap and sheep, but that's not really the same pronunciation. Gras and grass,
Hmm.
basic, West Germanic stuff. And I think from that perspective, Dutch is much closer to English than German in many respects because we also did not undergo the High German consonant shift. So we still have the P in slapen, as in sleep, and
Hmm.
and the T in water and water. Um, but yeah, I mean, Dutch is also a language in its own right. I mean, I if you say something like we hebben een serieus probleem, then yes, you're using words that are also used in English. There are clear cognates, even down to the borrowing of French sérieux, because we say serious in English, but we also say sérieux in Dutch.
Right.
Um, so yeah, that helps. But there are also quite a lot of words like well, I mean, let's go back to the example from the start of the video. Worden in Old English is worden in Dutch, but then you have
Hmm.
become in English. So if you saw a sentence with worden, would an English speaker recognize it? That kind of thing. And there are many
Yeah.
more examples like that, where, yeah, I mean, of course, you could use your knowledge of German. If you have a knowledge of German as an English speaker, that's usually more likely than having a knowledge of Dutch, I think, because German's spoken by a lot more people. Um, But yeah, I think it also depends on the sentences that you're reading.
Hmm. You say would an English speaker recognize that? I think maybe an English speaker from 11th century Wessex might recognize it. But who knows? I did want to ask about that though. So you're about to finish your PhD, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
And your dissertation, your area of specialty is on late West Saxon. Could you briefly explain what that is? I know we're kind of taking a shift now from general West Germanic linguistics and philology into specific Old English. But could you give maybe an explanation of what late West Saxon refers to?
Yeah, definitely. So late West Saxon was a dialect of Old English that was originally spoken in the Kingdom of Wessex. Hence, Wessex was the kingdom of the West Saxons. That's the etymology of the name. And so this kingdom initially comprised, most of the south of England, but due to historical circumstances, and I'm not a historian, I'm a linguist, so I won't go into detail. I won't go into the historical stuff that happened because I'm probably going to get a lot of stuff wrong. But following the unification of England in the 10th century under the Kingdom of Wessex, under the descendants of the Royal House of Wessex, we have from about the mid 10th century onwards something that we call Standard Old English, which was a standardized variety of the late West Saxon dialect. Um, and this dialect was essentially used from the mid 10th century onwards into the 12th century, even so into the first half of the 12th century. Now, among academics, the term standard Old English, standard Late West Saxon is debated. I don't think everyone agrees on whether we should call it a standard. But the fact of the matter is that in its heyday, in the 11th century, it was used all over the country. So we have manuscripts from the north of the country that also use this standard written language, this standard orthography. Um, It's mainly an orthographical standard, which is why it's also called with a nice English word, the Lake West Saxon Schriftsprache, which I probably butchered, but it's also in English academic literature. It's called a Schriftsprache, so it's a
Hmm.
written standard. Um, and yeah, what do you want me to say about it? Shall I give you some characteristics of the dialect? Would that
Yeah, that
help?
would be great. I mean, a long time ago, I had on a couple of our mutual friends to talk about Northumbrian, to talk about Kentish, and I think people were generally interested to hear about the fact that there were dialects in Old English. Some people never knew that before, that they kind of thought Old English was maybe a monolithic language, which of course no language is monolithic, but at least the fact that we know enough that there were dialects and that they were different and we know how they were different, I think is really fascinating to people. So could you define maybe what sets Late West Saxon initially apart from the rest of Old English?
Yeah, definitely. Um, Let me start by I think I'll do it this way. I'll give you some characteristics of West Saxon, also including early West Saxon, and then
Hmm.
and how it's different from the other dialects, and then I'll move into late West Saxon because I think that makes a little bit more sense in the explanation. So first of all, West Saxon differs from the other dialects, and then we're talking about Northumbrian, Mercian, and Kentish, obviously, in the fact that it has a long a. So we have the letter ash, which then, in addition appears with a macron, the long version of that, where the other dialects have a long a when they descend from that Proto-Germanic sound, which was probably pronounced air or a or something like that. So if we take the example West Saxon sad, which means seed you put in the ground, is
Hmm.
seed with a long a in the other dialects. Also, radon to read or to advise is
Hmm.
radon in the non-West Saxon dialects. So with a long e, a long a.
Yeah, including in Mercian, which is why in modern English, in archaic modern English, it's spelled as reed, reed, as in like
Yeah.
to advise. And obviously to read, we also say that, but specifically when you see in like I think it appears in Tolkien, I think he
Oh,
writes it in the Lord of the
wow.
Rings. I think he says like this is my reed, reed, because it comes from that long sound in Mercian. But sorry, continue.
No, that's great. I never knew that. Yes, because the modern verb read, as in I'm reading a book, is spelt as if it should be descended from the West Saxon form,
Yeah,
whereas
it's
something
odd.
like seed, the seed you put in the ground is with a double E, so that looks like it descends from
Hmm.
non-West Saxon. So yeah, but I didn't know that about Tolkien. That's fascinating. Um, One other thing that's a specifically early West Saxon feature, but has its descendant in late West Saxon, so still remains relevant, is the fact that early West Saxon has a diphthong, has two diphthongs, long and short, spelled I-E. Um, the pronunciation is debated. I use U, so an
Yeah.
EU um, combination, but some people say ear, so I schwa. Some people just
Mhm.
do a short monophthong. I think you do that, or
I pronounce it as E. Yeah. E, just a
yeah,
plain E. I
it's
think
not
that's
even
Campbell.
consistent in, yeah, it's not even consistent in early West Saxon, so it's
Hmm.
debatable, but it was written, and it's clearly a feature of West Saxon, um, where other dialects have equivalents like or e or eo, or it
Hmm.
depends on what the etymology is, but they do not have ear uh, or eu as a diphthong. Um, so I'm not talking about instances of IE where they're etymologically justified. So things like here for the pronoun they, that's a separate phenomenon. I'm talking about verbs like to laugh,
Hmm.
gluchan, which is usually something like chlechan in the other dialects, with simply with an e.
Hmm.
So spelling may vary, but you won't find that IE in non-West Saxon. Now, this IE becomes U in Late West Saxon. So its descendant remains. So the most common, well, I say this now, it usually becomes U, but it can also become E. It depends. So if you're looking for the verb to laugh in a Late West Saxon dictionary, you will find chluchan with a Y,
Hmm.
or maybe also chlichan with an I. Um, but it's not an eh. So you can see that late West Saxon is still distinct in this respect because it has its reflex, it has the descendant of that early West Saxon IE. So it's still set apart from the other dialects. That's the point I'm
Hmm.
trying to make. Um, and then another feature of both early and late West Saxon is that it has a restricted occurrence of back mutation. Back mutation means that you have, when you have a back vowel in a following syllable, so a vowel like a or u, vowels that are made in the back of your mouth, these vowels can modify a vowel that precedes it in the syllable that comes before it, and modify it to such an extent that it breaks. So it becomes two vowels, becomes a diphthong. So, for instance, in, let's say, in Old Saxon, you have heaven, which means
Hmm.
heaven, but in so this is Old Saxon, the language, not a dialect of Old English.
Right.
But in late West Saxon or any West Saxon, we have helvon. We have ao, helvon. So the vowel breaks due to the back vowel in the following syllable. Now, this thing, this phenomenon is it sort of depends on the Old English dialect, the extent to which this occurs. So, I think in Kentish, but I'm just speaking off the top of my head here. In Kentish, I think it's the most widespread, and then in Anglian, it's a little bit more limited. Only
Hmm.
occurs before certain consonants, and then in West Saxon, it's very limited. So it only happens in the vicinity of liquid or labial consonants. So in the vicinity of L, L, or labial consonants that are made with your lips, so f or b. So this is
Hmm.
why West Saxon has alu for beer, ale, alu with
Hmm.
ea, and helvon with a v, so spelt as an f, so a labial consonant.
Right.
Um, but West Saxon has wegas and sprekan. So wegas, ways, and sprekan to speak, whereas other dialects may have forms like weelgas and spreelkan.
Hmm.
They certainly occur. I think that those forms do occur in Kentish, and I think there might be Mercian as well. But I'm not a Mercian expert, so at the very least, I can tell you that they're not West Saxon.
Hmm.
One other feature of West Saxon is that it does not have long O. So if we have a Proto-Germanic, so the ancestor language of Old English has a vowel that's O. And Old English underwent a process that we call I mutation or I umlaut, in which vowels that occurred in a syllable before a E or a Y sound became rounded or moved to the front. So O became O, um, which means that in something like Proto Old English, the word green was something like groni. It went from groni to groni, and then this is what happened in West Saxon. It became a, so grene or grene in like West Saxon with a g. Um, West Saxon unrounded this long O very early on. The other dialects preserve that long O for longer, which I think, so if you're talking about the early period, that's definitely a distinctive feature of West Saxon as well.
Hmm.
And I think one final specific feature about West Saxon is that it has something that we call palatal diphthongization. It sounds very complicated, but it's not. So palatal means that following a palatal consonant, a consonant that's produced with your hard palate or with the hard palate in your mouth as an articulator. So something like y or ch, consonants that are produced there, they cause a following vowel to split into two to become a diphthong. So this means that a verb like give, which is in most dialects is something like yevon, becomes yuvon, so broken, yuvon, in West Saxon, and in late West
Hmm.
Saxon it becomes Yuvon, so it becomes a single sound again, but we're talking about early West Saxon here. It breaks due to that Y sound. And this is also why if we have like the early Old English form cold, that became cald, so it means cold, cald, and then the front vowel caused palatalization, so chald, and then in West Saxon, the palatal sound ch caused the breaking of the original a. So that's why the West Saxon word for cold is child, with a
Hmm.
broken sound, with a diphthong. Whereas Anglian, I think, retracted the a again. So now, so most Anglian dialects, meaning Northumbrian and Mercian, they say cold. And this is also
Yeah.
why we say cold in modern English, because modern English is descended from Mercian, which is an Anglian dialect.
Right. And that's why
Um,
we know that Simon Roper was using Mercian in his video because he said Se winter is long and cold, not
yes.
child, which,
Yeah.
child is more probably attested in our texts of Old English that survive today, but it's not where we get the modern word cold from. So,
Yeah.
it's not really useful in a video like that. Child.
Yeah, that's a very good point, by the way. I should have mentioned that, and I'm very glad you did. Most of the Old English that we have is written in West Saxon, and more
Yeah.
specifically, Late West Saxon, which is why it's such an important dialect to know about. Um, yeah, the center of power in England was in the south. A lot of textual production happened in the south, or at least in the yeah, South Midlands as well. Um, yeah, I think for anyone who who wants to learn Old English. If you open a grammar book, it will be in West Saxon. It will usually be in early West Saxon, but I think, more and more methods are appearing in which late West Saxon uh, gets more, pride of place
Yeah.
as well. And I think maybe in that respect, if that's all right with you, I want to mention just like three brief examples of the way in which late West Saxon differs from early West Saxon.
Well, I would like to talk about that, but before we move further on into
Yeah,
that direction linguistically, I think it's important to sort of ground ourselves within the history for a bit. Just for the sake of the viewers, in the ninth century, when the Vikings had conquered almost all of England, uh, that's when kind of King Alfred the Great comes to power.
yeah.
He achieves his name of the Great by basically keeping Wessex alive, sort of politically unifying the remaining English peoples. And in that time period, the court of Wessex becomes a center of learning, and it becomes a sort of haven for a lot of these texts to be stored, reprinted, and written about. And there are a lot of translations from the Latin that come into English at that time, and so on and so on. That I think, do correct me if I'm wrong, serves to carry a sort of prestige in Wessex over the next century or two as a sort of intellectual center. And there become all of these important scriptoriums. I'm thinking particularly the one at Winchester, for example, and a lot of really important manuscripts and texts are produced in Wessex at that time. Again, most most I think tangibly because it was relatively untouched. Again, I say relatively untouched by the Vikings compared at least to Northumbria, which had been a center of learning up until, for example, the raid at Lindisfarne. So once we get into the 10th century, then where we really start to see people like Ælfric, who we'll talk about, come into their own and really become intellectual powerhouses. Who are the sort of players that we want to pay attention to as students of Old English, as students of West Saxon in that time?
Um, I think definitely if you're talking about late West Saxon authors, then as you say, Ælfric is a pretty important one. He
Hmm.
was a Benedictine monk. I think it's also important to say sort of, the what happens before his time. So Ælfric started writing his texts in the very late 10th century, so about from 990 onwards. There are some earlier compositions, but this is sort of the time that we're talking about. Yeah, so the late 10th century. But the sort of the thing that led up to the increase in output in text as well, and the fact that West Saxon, late West Saxon became such a common dialect to write in is also the Benedictine reform
Oh, yes.
in the late 10th or in the mid 10th century to moving into the late
Hmm.
10th century. I think that's sort of the catalyst as well. So Benedictine reform is basically a move back towards more Benedictine ideals, I think, and also an increase in learning, an increase in translations as well from Latin originals to Old English. Um, Also increased copying activity. So
Hmm.
yeah, I think it's also just thanks to the Benedictine reform that we have a lot of Old English text in the first place, as well.
Yeah.
Um, so Alfred was a product of that 10th century phenomenon, really. And he's most famous for probably for writing homilies in fairly, easy to follow English prose. He also wrote a lot of saints' lives, but also completely different texts. So he also wrote the first vernacular grammar of Latin. I think it's officially, yeah, the first vernacular grammar of Latin.
It
So
is, yeah,
a grammar
in
in
any
Old
language.
English, yeah, for Latin, which is fantastic for us nowadays because we can also use it to study Old English. If he
Hmm.
gives um, if he gives a form like amor, and it says ich elm lovod, then that's perfect for us because we're like, okay, here we have a very nice Latin present passive, and we have a perfect Old English equivalent. Ich elm lovod. This is how he would have said it if in the passive. So it's wonderful for us. He also had added a glossary to that,
Hmm.
which is very useful. Um,
That text is
so that's quite important.
so cool. And the fact that he'll give us examples just like in a modern Latin textbook would,
Yeah,
where he says like, oh, you have to use the pronouns like this, you have to use the demonstratives like this, and he'll reference Old English by saying things like, it's just like in English how we say how non mon cuith say Bouton. No one says the pronoun say unless they've already mentioned
yeah,
that person. Well, that's really interesting. The
yeah,
learned English thinking about how like, oh, no one says this pronoun unless that person has already been mentioned. That he's letting us in on like his own thoughts on his own language, which is at the time so rare. Really,
yeah.
really cool stuff.
Yeah, it really shows some metalinguistic awareness on his part, which is amazing. One of my favorite comments is that he gives all these, I think in the chapter on conjunctions or something, he gives Latin
Oh
ets
yeah, I
and
know what you're about to
itque
say. Yeah.
and que and uck. And then he says, but in English we only have ond
Yeah.
or something like that. That's our way. Or it's, I don't remember the exact quote, but it's something like
He
in
says that
English,
there's so many Latin conjunctions for fireness because
yeah, for
for
fireness,
fireness.
that's what it is. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
because it's beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I love that.
Poor guy.
So we have a grammar written by him, but we also have a text that deals with natural phenomena. So like the weather, or the stars, or the sun. Of
Hmm.
course, from a Christian creation, point of view, but also just talking about how snow exists or how rain comes to be, things like that. Um, yeah, what else? Letters
Hmm.
to the monks of Eynsham. He was from Eynsham. That's why we call him Ælfric of Eynsham. Um, or at least that's where he spent the latter part of his career. Um, and yeah, he is single-handedly responsible for, I think off the top of my head, 16% of the current Old English corpus, which is a lot.
Insane.
Old Testament
Yeah.
translations. Um, so if you study Old English, you will see Alfred at some point. If
Hmm.
only for the fact that his texts are very easy to follow and are written in what, in my subjective opinion, very elegant but simple Old English.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, definitely biblical translation. So I know he didn't translate all of the Hexateuch, but he did like Genesis 1 until 17 or something like that, and then he did,
Yeah.
I think, Judges, all of Judges, but he didn't really do Exodus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. No, he didn't. So because there's a different style as well, so it's interesting. He's sort of he interweaves himself
Uh-huh.
in these translation things, but he also wrote a
It's
really good summary of the whole Bible, which is known as the letter to Siward. He wrote
mhm.
this letter to a guy called Siward, um, who was probably one of his patrons or someone who knew him. Yeah, he probably was a patron because he asked him, can you summarize the Bible for me? And it's this huge letter. But it's great because
Yes.
in a way it's also another kind of translation. It's a I think a transcreation, as some people may
Hmm.
call it, um, and that's essentially what he did with his homilies as well. His homilies, if you're being nasty to Alfred, then you would say his homilies are all translations because they're based on Latin source material. But usually they're called compositions because he takes all of these various sources,
Hmm.
Bede, uh, Paul the Deacon,
Yeah, I was about to say.
Augustine.
Hmm.
And he transforms it into something that is really Ælfrician. It's his own, his own theologies in the homilies as well. So it's no, in that respect, he's pretty important.
I love that letter where he talks about his being commissioned to translate parts of Genesis, where he recounts it himself how he was asked to translate Genesis, and he was like, "Hell no! Like I'm not gonna do that. That's really dangerous, and you're tampering with the holy translation into Latin." And then the guy's like, "Okay, I'm gonna get someone else to do it," and he's like, "Okay, okay, fine. I'll
Yeah.
I'll do the first couple passages."
Alfred was notoriously wishy-washy in that respect because at the end of the second series of Catholic homilies, he says, "And I say now that I will never henceforth translate another homily into English again." And he went on to translate many, many more homilies into
Yeah.
English following the second series of Catholic homilies. So,
Hmm.
it could also just be a kind of commonplace, kind of thing to say like, "Oh no, I wouldn't dare do this again," but then secretly,
Yeah. Well, also, as a monk, you have these like secular people in positions of power that just tell you to do things, and
yeah,
a lot of times there's not much you can say. You like someone says, I want you to give a bunch of homilies to this group of people, and what are you supposed to say? No.
true. Yeah, he had a patron called off the top of my head, I think he was called Athelward,
Hmm.
who commissioned
Athelward
him.
Alderman.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he mentions him in the prefaces as well explicitly. Um, yeah. So if you have a patron and he gives you an assignment and you think, well, this might be very beneficial to the monastery where I'm the abbot, because Alfred, I should have mentioned Alfred was an abbot in
Hmm.
the remainder of his life. Um, then you would do that. You know,
Yeah.
you would do it for the good of your monastery.
Well, so then after Alfred, maybe during and then after Alfred, where does late West Saxon go? So, how has it changed once we get to him? How does it change after him? I know you've often expressed frustration with the idea that Old English just kind of vanishes as soon as William the Conqueror sets foot in England. Um, but what happens?
So after Alfred, I think it's good to briefly mention that we also have Wulfstan, the
That's true,
Archbishop
yeah.
of York, Bishop of Worcester. We don't know his date of birth, but he died in 1023. Also wrote a lot of homilies, but was more of a statesman. So he also wrote law codes, including for the
Hmm.
Scandinavian king, so for Knut. But he also wrote texts about how to behave in society, like how people should behave
Hmm.
in society, like the Institutes of Polity. He's the other famous late West Saxon author that you're very likely to read.
Yeah.
Only if it were the Sermo Lupi ad Anglos, that's usually in the Old English curricula.
Readers and
Um,
stuff like that. He uses the
yeah.
word "yebireth," like you should, like probably more, like 100 times more than any other Old English writer we have.
Yeah,
Like you should do
that's
this, you
true.
should do that.
Yeah.
He's a big
Yeah.
lecturer.
Yeah, yeah, it's true. And I would say
Yudavanath as well.
yeah, big and this is and now let's move into to what you just said, what happens to West Saxon. I think when you look at Alfred's West Saxon, um it is different from earlier West Saxon in a number of ways. For instance, there's no dedicated subjunctive plural ending anymore. So the subjunctive plural in early West Saxon is n, so en,
Hmm.
but in Alfred's you would usually find it as on. So identical to the
Yeah.
indicative past ending, but of course still distinct in the present because um, if I wanted to say something like "let them love."
Hmm.
Then I would say something like Luvion he.
Yeah.
So early West Saxon, I would say Luvien he, but late West Saxon, Luvion he, at least in spelling. Um, Also, Alfrich has a unified ending for strong adjectives in the singular, nominative singular, and also in the nominative accusative plural. So this just means that the feminine u. So if I wanted to say something like sumu widower, some widow, a certain
Hmm.
widow, in Alfrich is simply sum widower. So the
Yeah.
u for short stemmed adjectives in the feminine is gone. It's just there's no ending in the nominative singular, and in the plural the ending is only e. So golden men. Gode weef, neuter plural, gode juva, good gifts,
Yeah.
gode. So masculine, neuter, feminine. I did it in the wrong order, but you get what I mean. So there's a unified ending. Um, I think there was one other thing that I wanted to mention. Yes, so I sort of mentioned this, I think, at the start of the video, but Ælfric basically didn't have an instrumental. Late West Saxon basically didn't have an instrumental. There were no distinct forms for that case anymore, except in fossilized phrases. So Ælfric says things like alce die,
Hmm.
alce with an e, the historical instrumental singular ending, and then die without an ending, which is historically correct. Don't ask me about what happened from Proto-Old English to get to that, but it's historically correct. It just dropped. So alce die.
Hmm.
And of course, conjunctions like forthu for that reason, because forthu, thu is historically the instrumental pronoun. And also when you want to express certain times, thu jaren, in that year, or thu day, on that day. So that's kind of basically the extent to which the instrumental survived in Late West Saxon, so set phrases.
Hmm.
Um, Once you move into the 11th century, what you see happen in West Saxon is I think one of the most salient things is that the back vowels start to get confused. So a, o, and u are used increasingly interchangeably. So we were talking about Wolfstan. I think one of the famous openings of one of his texts is something like Bishopan, Kuningon, uh, uh, Archbishopan, a whole list of dative plurals. Yadavanath, that he, X don. That
Yeah.
it is fitting for them that they do something. But it's a whole list of unendings for the dative plural. Whereas if you
Hmm.
open an Old English grammar, you would expect it to be
Hmm.
And then we're talking about so the early, that's yeah, like the 1020s, 1010s, 1020s. But you see throughout the 11th century that on and on as well, on, are quite common as equivalents for the dative plural ending We also see this kind of confusion in the verbal endings. So normally the past indicative and also past subjunctive by this point. The past ending is on. So he luvodon, they loved.
Hmm.
But you will be equally likely to find it as he luvodan
Hmm.
in especially later in the 11th century.
Hmm.
This is still quite interesting because we would normally assume that in the 11th century, at some point, all of these unstressed vowels collapse. So including with e. Um, but late West Saxon does not like doing things like Bishopen and Kuningen for like the dative plural. It doesn't yet do that. That's really a 12th century feature. So they allow themselves a little bit more wiggle room in terms of certain morphological endings, but they don't fully go into that unstressed spelling yet, even though they may already be pronouncing it, which is interesting, I think.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, and you also see this in this is one other interesting feature. Usually, grammars will give the neuter plural ending as u or zero. So an ship, toi shipu, for instance, or yeah, if it's a zero ending, something like an wort, toi wort. But Ælfric and a lot of late West Saxon also allows a as a neuter plural ending. So Ælfric especially does this for neuter words of more than one syllable. So Ælfric's plural for something like bebod, which means
Hmm.
commandment, is I think most often beboda, not bebodu. Even though it's
Yeah.
it's that bebod, it's a neuter noun. So a is an acceptable ending for him. Wundor, wundra, miracle, miracles. So I
I
think
think I can, but
yeah.
to that specific example, I think it's really interesting. You're pointing this out, and I'm realizing for the first time there are like famous lines in Alfred's writings, like in the soliloquies. There's I think a interaction I'm remembering where the interlocutor asks Augustine like, "Do you love God?" And Augustine says, "Yes, of course." And then the interlocutor, his schaudwiesness, his sort of
Mhm.
wisdom, says, "Haldfunne his bebodu," hold his commandments. But then
Yeah.
in an Ælfric homily, if I'm not mistaken, there's a line where Christ says something along the same thing, like "Haud mean babola" or something like that, or
Yeah.
mina, I think. And
Yeah,
I've
yeah,
never
mean it.
noticed that
That's
that's
like West
different.
Saxon, indeed. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I've never noticed that that's different, but that's really interesting because it's same
Yeah.
dialect, just I guess 100, maybe even 150 years apart. Pretty
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah, one thing that I find amazing about the soliloquies is that even though it mainly survives in a 12th century manuscript, it really preserves an early West Saxon state of the
Mm.
language. I think yeah, I don't know the soliloquies as well as you. I can't quote off the top of my head, but I do remember seeing like oo endings for adjectives in the feminine nominative singular, for instance, and thinking, well, this would never happen in Ælfric, but it's interesting that they even preserved it in its 12th century copy that they have this oo
Yeah,
ending, despite the garbled state of the rest of the spelling. The
it's a really
endings are
weird
quite
one. Yeah.
well preserved, but that's definitely a difference as well. Yeah. Um, so what happens? West Saxon is preserved into the 12th century, I would say. So the
Hmm.
Norman Conquest, of course, happens in 1066. Um, the production
To the
of
chagrin
English,
of many of the viewers.
yeah. Mark Faulkner recently wrote an excellent book about what happens in the long 12th century. I think it's called A New Literary History of the Long 12th Century.
Hmm.
Great book. In which he argues, so I'm just going to be quoting him now, but he argues that first the production of English decreases and Latin increases, and then from about 1130, 1140 onwards, French vernacular production really takes off. There are really two periods that we're dealing with, and I think in the first period, so until 1140, late West Saxon is I think scribes attempt to maintain it in some ways. So if you look at the Peterborough Chronicle, the copy of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that was produced at Peterborough Abbey, it's very interesting that you can read annals from 1110, 1112, 1115, and see that they're written in quite accurate late West Saxon, with
Hmm.
perfectly fine genitives, datives, etc. It would also have been fine in 1050 or 1080, for instance. So it's a bit of a myth that West Saxon just dies in 1066 and then all of a sudden the people in England only start writing Middle English. That's not really what happens. They try and maintain it in some way, but then after you get the first continuation of the Peterborough Chronicle, so 1122, then you see bizarre kind of um, attempts at maintaining West Saxon. So you see forms like Seeburg for Seelburg, the city.
Hmm.
Um, Thona, where you would expect a masculine dative. Uh, Thada, where you would expect an acute and feminine accusative.
Yeah.
So it just they're trying, but they're failing. And then after 1130, after 1131, the second continuation, it's just th, and the syntax is more Middle English, and you can see that they've sort of, well, maybe given up sounds really negative, but they've realized at some level that they no longer master that standard written dialect, and so they decide to write differently, closer to the way they were speaking. Um, and my own research, if it's all right that we sort of move into that, or did
Oh
you want to
yeah,
know
I was
more
going to
about?
ask either way.
Yeah. Um, So my research focuses on copies of Ælfric's Catholic homilies, and I'm focusing on 10 of these homilies, originally composed in 990, so in the very late 10th century, but copied between 1050 and 1200. And the reason why this is interesting um, is because 1200 for most people is squarely in the Middle English period, whether you believe that Middle English started in 1100 or 1150 or 1066. 1200 is definitely Middle English. So
Hmm.
what I was trying to do with my dissertation is see how these copies differ from each other. How does the grammar evolve? How do how does the vocabulary change? Um, and I've managed to use a program called CollateX, which takes transcriptions of these manuscripts as an input. At first, I had to make the transcriptions, obviously, where they didn't exist yet. They
Hmm.
take the manuscripts as an input, And then what you get is a CSV file, so a column comma separated values file, which you can transform to an Excel file with columns. And then what you get is a word by word homily with the equivalents in later manuscripts in, per column.
Hmm.
And that enables you to see, for instance, that dative plurals may lose their nasal in the late 12th century. That forms like midthambocum may become midthamboke, which is, of
Hmm.
course, is very weird, but they do occur. Um, and you see that vocabulary is updated. So Ælfric uses laagdor, for instance, for sin. He also uses sun, but he also uses laagdor. And you see that in later copies, this form is replaced by sun. Antwoordan, to answer, is replaced by answarian. Jereord means language, is replaced by spraach. So I didn't find many Old French or Old Norse loanwords in the data set. What I mainly found is that um, native Old English vocabulary is replaced by other native Old English vocabulary, but usually in the direction of, these words still existing in modern English. So we've
Right.
lost antwoorden, but we still say answarian, we say answer, we have its
Yeah.
descendant. Um, I've got a couple of instances of quedon replaced by sedjon. So we've
Oh.
lost queeth, unless we say bequeath, but it of course means something else. We now only say. So Sejong, of course, being the replacing word, makes sense from a historical linguistic point of view. Um, yeah, so it's not a huge corpus. It'll become available online somewhere this year, so you can check it out for yourself. But I do think this kind of research is important because most people have said, oh, well, we can't really know what happened between Old English and Middle English because we don't have that many texts from the 12th century. We've got the Peterborough Chronicle, we've got the Ormulum, there's another famous text from the late 12th
Hmm.
century, mid to late 12th century. Um, we've got Lachemont's Brut, which, is now dated, I think, to around 1200, but might have been composed earlier. Vices and Virtues from the southeast. Um, but we don't really we can't, because late West Saxon was used for such a long time, we don't really know the changes that happened in the 11th century because the standard orthography obscured the developments. And that's true. But we also have a lot of copies of Old English, and I think if you
Hmm.
look at the copies of Old English and don't treat them as natural linguistic productions, obviously, if I copy a text from if I copy Shakespeare, try and copy Shakespeare now, I can update the thou to you, and I can update other archaic vocabulary to modern equivalents. But of course, you know that it's Shakespeare, and these
Hmm.
people knew that it was Ælfric. I'm not saying that these copies on the same level as the Ormulum, as spontaneously produced 12th century English. But what I am saying is that they can be used as additional evidence
Hmm.
for the study of the development from Old English to Middle English because I think it's such a fascinating process.
How do we date these manuscripts?
They are usually dated paleographically, so you can
Ah,
look
I
at the
see.
ink, you can look at the shape of the letters, also based on things like how the ruling is done. Um, Also, sometimes, yeah, the binding. Sometimes we know when a manuscript was produced, but I think it's normally a combination of these things. You look at the manuscript, you check the shape of the letters and that kind of thing.
Mm.
Yeah.
I know I don't want to take up too much of your time. I can
Oh
see
no, you're
that
not.
the Dutch sun has set behind you,
Yeah.
but I did want to ask what originally got you into Old English? That's kind of my last question. When did you start studying this stuff?
I think, yeah, well, it's a nice sort of circular thing you've done here because if we go all the way back to the beginning, I was raised speaking both Dutch and English, and I
Yeah.
think that's when I was 12 or something, or 11 or 12, I think we went on holiday to Canterbury, and my mum bought me a copy of the Canterbury Tales. And I remember looking in the glossary and seeing verbs like rennen and sterven and thinking, this is Dutch, but it's English,
Hmm.
it's Chaucer. And then I thought, well, what comes before Chaucer? And so when I was like 13, 14, I think I really started studying Old English. And yeah, the fact that it was mind-blowing to me that the languages that were always sort of a mix in my head, um, that Old English sort of gave me that same feeling. It's subjective, but I thought this is really cool. And I loved languages already at that point. But because it sort of felt like the language was already so familiar to me, I sort of loved it instantly. And from
Mhm.
that point, yeah, I decided to study Old English at university and was lucky enough to be allowed to do this for the past 4 years as a job. So that was it's a nice bonus.
Yeah. All right. Well, Amos van Baalen, thank you very much for coming onto the channel and sharing your knowledge of West Saxon with us. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.